we're going to dive right in. I'm Dorothy Littell Greco. I will let Sheila introduce herself, but I just wanted to give a word on why I wanted to have this conversation with her. I have found Sheila to be an incredibly trustworthy voice on these sensitive but very important topics. And for a long time, about 15 years now, she's been providing evidence-based information toward the goal of correcting unhealthy patterns of sexuality, especially in Christian settings. And she's also been a remarkable advocate for women as they move towards having healthy and fulfilling sexual relationships with their spouses. So our hope is that this conversation is encouraging, informative, and Sheila, I've said this to you before, but I'm so grateful for your work and for your courage. So thank you for taking the time to talk with me tonight. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Sheila Ray Gregoire. I am an author, a podcaster, and a researcher. Our team at Bare Marriage has done the largest research projects into evangelical marriage and sexual satisfaction, looking at how a lot of tropes that we hear in evangelicalism actually make things worse. And we've written a number of books. Our team, Great Sex Rescue, She Deserves Better, The Marriage You Want. We're just hoping to change the conversation about sex and marriage in the evangelical church so that it's actually something that is healthy, evidence-based, and still biblical. And that's a big task. It feels like a very big task.
Yes.
Yeah. But I need to say too,
So just to know,
I just want to say
go
too,
ahead.
as we're starting off, I so appreciated Dorothy's book. You were on my podcast when it first came out, For the Love of Women. And it's just looking at how misogyny, like the literal hatred of women, is so prevalent in all kinds of areas of our culture. And it's like you read the book and you're like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. It's very validating. So, yeah. So we're going to be talking about one particular
Thank
chapter
you.
in this book tonight. But yeah.
Right. Right. And just to note, several things. One is that the internet connection seems to be going in and out on my end. It's not unusual when we have really rainy weather, so apologies if it dies out. Sheila's just going to keep going. This is a
I'll just keep
PG-13
talking.
conversation, so be aware of who might be listening in the room. And I just want to preemptively answer two questions that I always get asked when I talk about misogyny. No, it's not all men, and yes, women can be misogynist. So now that that's out of the way. I work as a professional photographer, a writer, and an author. I have written 3 books. The first 2 were marriage books, Making Marriage Beautiful and Marriage in the Middle. And then my most recent book, as Sheila just referenced, is For the Love of Women, Uprooting and Healing Misogyny in America. And the last book explores how misogyny shows up in 6 sectors of American life, including healthcare, the workplace, the government, intimate relationships, and the church. And then the last 2 chapters focus on healing and how we could chart a new path forward. So early on in For the Love of Women, I redefined misogyny because I think that the common definition, which is simply the hatred of women, is just not extensive enough. Too many men can wiggle out of that. So I just want to quickly read the definition that I have in the book. Misogyny is
We lost her. Maybe
more important than women, religious and social systems, as well as intimate relationships, should uphold this principle. This belief system subsequently influences the laws, policies, practices, and ethos of a given culture. So when we begin to see misogyny as a system of prioritizing and preferring men while simultaneously devaluing and harming women, then we can begin to understand how pervasive and how damaging misogyny really is. And it does show up everywhere, in the halls of power, in churches, and unfortunately in the bedroom. So this can range from husbands or partners pressuring women to have sex, even if the woman has expressed that she's tired or she doesn't feel well, to men prioritizing their sexual pleasure, all the way to abuse. So, Sheila, I just wanted to ask you, what are some of the ways or other indicators that misogyny might be present in an intimate relationship?
I think, obviously, we've got abuse and all of those things, but I think one of the biggest issues is entitlement. And we see this show up in multiple ways in marriages, not just in the bedroom, but the idea that a man is entitled to something is entitled to a
Mhm.
woman's work, access to her body, or whatever in ways that he doesn't have to work for it. So she has to work for it, but he
Mhm.
does not. So, he's entitled to a home cooked meal. He's entitled to sex. He's entitled to coming home and being able to relax.
Right.
So he is entitled to these things simply because he's a man, whereas she is not entitled to these things. And she has to work harder than he does for the relationship. And a
Yeah.
simple example, and this happens all the time in our extended family, right? Like you'll have the family over for Thanksgiving dinner, for Christmas dinner, whatever. And at the end of the dinner, who gets up to clean? And
Right.
in our family, it's always the younger generation. So boys and girls, which is great. So my kids' generation, the millennials and the Gen Zs, both men and women get up. But among our generation, and there's quite a few of us, it's only my
Mm.
husband who gets up,
Yeah.
right? All of the other men
I'm
naturally
assuming
stay
she was saying
seated.
boys and girls get help clean, but,
Yeah.
so you cut out there, but I think what you said is that boys and girls get up, but the men stay seated.
Yeah.
Was that
Yeah,
the
that's right. So the
conclusion
men
there?
in my generation in Gen X and the
Yeah.
boomer men would not get up and help clean. So, the responsibility for making dinner and for cleaning fell largely well, for making dinner fell entirely to the women. For cleaning fell to Gen Z and millennials. The men would get
Yeah.
up and to my husband, and that was it. And that's just such a simple example,
Mm.
but, the idea that
Yeah.
men just get to sit there and get waited on. No one necessarily taught
Yeah.
us this. No one sat down and said, "Hey, men deserve to not have to clean." But somehow this has
Right.
become our practice. And so, we see entitlement in all kinds of different areas in the family. But, as we're going to talk about, it especially shows up in the bedroom where the idea is that his needs
Yeah.
matter. And so she has to provide for his needs whether or not he has done the
Right.
work. And
Right.
I keep thinking, and people will say, well, that's the way that men feel connected. But so what they're really arguing is that he has the right to feel connected through sex without having to do any of the work of actually connecting with his wife. Yeah,
Exactly.
and that's a huge problem.
Yeah.
So I just
Yeah.
want to say
And I think that when
we've got about 50
yeah.
people watching here. If anyone has any questions of what we're saying, like it's so great just to have you guys all like put the comments in because that way we don't feel like we're talking to a void. So yeah, go ahead and go go ahead, ask comments, like say something. That would be great too. So mhm,
Yeah, I think that men who feel entitled to women's bodies will take what they want, when they want, how they want it, with little regard for how it affects women. And
mhm,
selfishness, in my opinion, selfishness is really behind there, even if a man wouldn't be able to say, "Oh, I'm being selfish."
mhm,
But that to pressure women to do things that they may feel uncomfortable doing or that actually are painful. Um, Multiple years ago, I don't know, maybe 10, 12 years ago, my husband Christopher and I were doing a marital workshop at a Christian marriage conference. And he was advocating in this particular moment that when a wife says, I'm just too tired to have sex tonight, that the husband, rather than withdrawing or rather than punishing her, um, should find other ways to connect and to come alongside of his wife. And as he finished that beat, a young man grabbed his wife's hand and literally pulled her out of her seat and stormed off through the door.
oh,
Like he totally, made a scene. And
oh,
then later on the evaluations, he communicated his anger towards Christopher's advice and wrote, this is verbatim, when I want sex, I'm going to get sex.
yeah,
And, I have often thought about his wife and wondered, like this, who feel entitled to their wives' bodies, are opting for an orgasm and control over intimacy, building trust, and loving sacrificially. And given that the pleasure of an orgasm lasts, what, maybe 30, 60 seconds,
mhm.
that seems
For men, for women, it can
choice to
last
me.
longer. For
Yeah,
men,
right, right. That's what I mean. Yeah. And I think that that's what entitlement it does. It skews
Mhm,
reality and it reduces people's ability to care about or consider others' needs. So, just a question for you. How prevalent do you feel like misogyny is in, you were in Canada, but I think the cultures between,
mhm.
America and Canada are similar enough. Um, what is it like there? And do you think that certain subcultures empower or endorse entitlement in the bedroom?
Yeah, it's interesting For a survey of 22,000 women for the Great Sex Rescue, we had statistically significant results for 6 nations. And some of you may have heard me share this before, but I'll tell you what the 6 nations were. Okay, so we had the United States, Canada, the UK, New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa, with the big caveat that our South African and American data subsets, were largely white, largely Caucasian. So of those 6 nations, which do you think was the healthiest? Do you wanna
New
guess?
Zealand?
Anyone can guess too if you what did you just say?
I'd say New Zealand just because it
Yeah!
seems like yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and the UK was not that far behind. Which do you think was the worst?
I'd say either South Africa or the United States.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So South Africa was the worst, but the United States wasn't that far behind. And then Canada and Australia were kind of in the middle, and we kept changing spots depending on what specifically we were measuring, so it wasn't as
Yeah.
obvious. So yes, it is not as bad in Canada as it is in the US, but it is still bad. But what we do find is that entitlement in the bedroom is greater among evangelicals than it is among the general
Wow.
population. And
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 why?
and that's what I find so disturbing because Christians as a whole do have better marriages and sex lives than the general population. But when you look at the subset of evangelicals who have internalized a lot of the things that we are taught in our marriage and sex bestsellers, you find that we actually do worse than the general population. So
Interesting.
so these teachings are really hurting us. And I mean, yes, you were giving the example of that one man from the marriage conference, and that really sounds like marital rape, right? Like we can get to the extent where you're
Yes.
looking
Yeah.
at marital rape. And marital rape isn't just pressuring or forcing someone physically to have sex. It can also be using a sex toy on them without their consent,
Mhm.
even if they reach orgasm, by the way. So you can reach orgasm and still not have consented. um it can look like having sex in order to stop something bad from happening. So I would get
Mhm.
messages
Mhm.
from women saying, I have to have sex with him on Sunday mornings before we go to church, or else he lusts after other women and he tells me that he can't stop unless we have sex, or I have to have sex with him before small group, or else he'll embarrass me in public. This, so that is
Wow.
that is coercion as well. But then there's also the group of men where it isn't necessarily coercion in the same way, but it's that, like, if they don't have sex, if you're too tired, if you say no, they pout, they're grumpy, and they punish you
Right. Right.
emotionally.
Right.
A and that's also a form of coercion. It's not as obvious,
Yeah.
but that's also how entitlement shows up. They may not take it, like, they may not force you, they may not take
Yeah.
sex from you,
Yeah.
but if you don't have sex, then they're gonna make sure you feel it for the next few
Right.
days, and they're gonna punish you
There's a
by
price to pay.
disconnecting
Yeah.
emotionally. And that isn't always, like, deliberate. I think sometimes it's that, men have been discipled so horribly in this situation where they've been taught
Yeah.
that, um the only way that they have to deal with any kind of emotional regulation issue is to reach orgasm because they've never been taught how to handle their emotions. And so
Right.
orgasm is the way they make themselves feel better. And they were told that God gave you marriage so that this would fulfill you. And so then when you don't give him sex, he has no way of emotionally regulating because he hasn't ever been taught that. And so he takes it out on you. And so it's like, it still is bad. It still is entitlement, but it all comes from this complete failure of discipling men properly too. And instead putting all of the burden for men's emotional regulation, for men's sin management, etc., onto women, which is another form of misogyny. It's making women do the work
Yes.
for men to control men's emotions and control men's just affect. So mhm.
Yeah, with so much pressure that comes down through that system, and it is so tragic that we continue to hear teaching, that books continue to get written that are promoting this, and that
Mhm.
rather than helping men to identify what their emotions are, what their emotional needs are, everything gets bundled into sex, and
Yeah.
therefore it just takes on this conflated importance.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I
and
shared
I
I
think
shared a
that's one of
video I shared a video on YouTube yesterday, so you can go look at my YouTube channel. It's just under Sheila Gregoire if you search for it. Just it's an 11-minute clip from a previous podcast where we were looking at a clip from Jana Howerton, who is Josh Howerton's wife, and she's talking about how important it is to give your husband sex. And again, she says that's the way men connect, and so he needs it to connect. And it's that conflating of intimacy with a man's orgasm as if
right.
he can feel connected even if you feel used. So even if you feel used, even if you feel like emotionally worse, he'll feel great. And like that's not intimacy.
It's
That
not.
that that
Yeah.
has nothing to do with
Yeah.
intimacy. Yeah.
Yeah, it's confusing sexual release with intimacy when they're missing the point, and I think that's part of what is just beguiling to me, that when men, act out of a space of entitlement and demand this kind of sexual, servicing from their wives, it's really counterproductive, right?
Mhm.
Because essentially if a woman does not feel valued, if she doesn't feel loved, if she doesn't feel like her sexual needs are taken into account in the bedroom, she's going to be less interested in having sex. I mean, in the 20,
Yeah.
25 years that Christopher and I have been doing marriage counseling and speaking at marriage conferences, many women have confided to me that they are no longer interested in sex because they feel used and they
Yep.
don't think that their husband cares about what they want or need
Yep.
in the ble in the bedroom. So when men play the entitlement card, sex can feel more like an obligation than an opportunity to deeply connect and to experience pleasure together. And then couples might actually feel disconnected, after being in bed together. So,
Yeah, and
I
we
don't know
had
whether
8
you
yeah,
have
we had
thoughts on,
we found, in our survey, I think it was 18%, but 18% of women said that their primary emotion after sex 18% of evangelical women said their primary emotion after sex was feeling used. So for those women,
Mm,
they would have felt more connected had they not had sex. So this idea that sex is automatically connecting is
right.
simply untrue. Quality of sex matters. And I love this comment by
Yeah,
Annie.
and
I want to ask all evangelical men the question, why in the world would you want to have an intimate experience with someone who is not into it? Like, why would you want to experience that? What about coercion feels good to you? Yeah. And
well,
I,
it's power, right?
mm-hmm,
That's part of it, and
mm-hmm,
valuing orgasm over true intimacy.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I think combining that because there's also an emotional immaturity aspect to it. So you have the
Right.
group that is really into power, but then you have the group, and this is the group that bothers me especially because I think the people about who are about power would have been like that regardless. You know,
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
whether they read the Every Man's Battle books or whether they read Love and Respect, they still would have been about power.
Yeah.
But there's also this group of evangelical men who are just really emotionally immature. And had they not read these books, they may not have had these dynamics in their marriage. And that's what makes me so angry because I don't think like,
Mhm.
the people that are just into power, they're going to do it regardless and they might use the books to justify
Yeah.
it, but they would have done it anyway. But then you have these emotionally immature men who don't know how to connect, who don't know how to be vulnerable with people, who, started masturbating at age 13 to porn, and that's the way they dealt with rejection and
Mhm.
boredom, etc. And they got married thinking that marriage would cure it, and it doesn't.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and they feel like, well, God gave me my wife so that she could be my lawful sexual outlet, and it's godly to use my wife. It's much godlier to use my wife than to use porn. And so, like, they're actually hurting their wife, but they think they're being godly. And that's what makes
Yeah,
me
it's
so angry.
tragic.
It is because they would not have been like that. And you had a quote in your book. I wrote it down. Let me just read this. That kind of suggests this. So let me read you this. Let me read you what you said about Nick. So you tell the story of Nick and his wife in For the Love of Women in that chapter, and you said this. Nick believes the combination of being raised by a narcissistic, sex addicted father, coupled with his own addictions and the church's teachings about male headship, led him to conclude that not only was he entitled to sex, but that entitlement was God ordained. Part of why it took him so long to figure this out is that he was immersed in a patriarchal Christian culture that empowered misogyny. When Nick shared his struggles with someone from church, they suggested reading the book Every Man's Battle, which, according to Nick, fueled my misogynistic view of entitlement by suggesting that my wife's availability would resolve my issues. It also places more responsibility on the woman to be modest and available than it puts on the man to get help and develop self control. It did not speak of mutuality. I can now see how toxic that book was to a young, addicted man seeking help. And you think about the Nicks of the world, and you think,
Yeah.
how could that marriage have been different if he hadn't have read Every Man's Battle and he hadn't have been in a patriarchal church? Because that damaged Nick. But then you think about the trauma that
Yes,
happened to his wife
exactly.
that came from obligation, sex, and coercion based on his
Right.
entitlement to her body. So it's like Nick didn't start out as a super bad guy, right? He just had this whole conflation of issues that all met in this patriarchal evangelical culture that empowered his entitlement. And so that
Yeah.
that made sure that he didn't have to emotionally grow. And then it made sure that his wife experienced trauma.
Yes.
And that was completely preventable. That was completely preventable. I
Yeah.
think abusers would have been abusers no matter what books they read, but there's an awful lot of Nicks who wouldn't necessarily have been abusers except for the teaching in the evangelical church.
Yeah. And I want to talk at the very end of this about what we can do to combat that. But let's just take a minute to segue and talk about pornography. Um, I think that you would know from reading my book that I think that pornography is inherently misogynistic and therefore it's harmful for both the men and women. And when men routinely watch porn, they learn to objectify their partners and they also
Mhm.
learn to expect things from them that center male pleasure, right? The woman on the screen never demands anything from them and never expresses any dissatisfaction. So it's very easy, but pornography then ends up habituating that towards behaviors that degrade and harm women.
Mhm.
Um, and I hope I'm not putting you on the spot for this, but like, what do you feel like some of the manifestations that porn causes, other than what we just talked about? What are some of the potential problems that flow downstream from couples? Because now women are using it more too, statistically. That's what
Mhm.
I've been reading. But
Mhm.
what are some of the potential problems for couples that flow downstream from pornography use?
Especially because pretty much all porn is violent. Okay, pretty much all porn
Yeah.
has women being hurt as part of it. And so I think our sex lives are becoming more violent, and that is not
Yes.
something which women actually enjoy. Very, very few women actually enjoy that. And so the things that women are being expected to do, like I get asked, but how do I say no? My husband just keeps pressuring me for certain sex acts that I don't want to do, that hurt, that are uncomfortable, that gross me out.
Yeah.
And like women shouldn't be pressured into that. I have had an uptick on a very strange phenomenon that I have not experienced before in the last couple of months. And I think this is coming from porn too. And I think this has sort of entered into the manosphere. But I've had a lot of men on my posts where I talk about the orgasm gap saying that it's women's
Mhm.
fault because they say, well, men get their orgasm anyway. A woman just needs to work for her orgasm. Men work for theirs. Women need to work for theirs. It's not up to the man to give a woman an orgasm. And I've never had men say this before, but like this has been a thing that multiple people have been saying. And now I've started to see reels from men talking about how women's orgasm is probably a myth. I've never seen it, but if they want an orgasm, they need to be working for it. Like it's whatever misogynistic term they want to use, for a man to have to give a woman an orgasm because that means that he's being a sissy. I don't know, whatever they're saying, right? And I
It's so
find that
bizarre.
I find that wild. But this idea that it's a total first of all, it completely misunderstands basic biology, right? That women are not
Right.
aroused in the same way in general by the things that arouse men, and they need a lot more different
More time, right?
more
Yeah.
time, and different stimulation than men tend to need, and that isn't something that she
Yeah.
can give herself. Uh,
Right.
and I mean, to not to be really crass, but, um, just imagine, and I this is crass. Okay, so excuse me, I'm about to be crass, but I think this is important. But if you think about the motions that are used when a man masturbates versus the motions that are used when a woman does or stimulates herself,
I went to lose internet.
okay, like which one resembles intercourse more? It's like men are getting the stimulation from intercourse that women are not. And so this idea that women should have to work for their own orgasm without a man doing anything and it's up to her to chase it, that's just simply not biologically right. And I find it wild that men are now saying this. And I do think that's a more modern phenomenon that comes from pornography because I haven't seen that and really until this year. So,
Well, it sounds so individual to pleasuring each other, like learning what does it mean to pleasure one another, which
mhm,
is a journey. And for women, it's far less linear than it is for men. And I
mhm,
think of like for myself as someone who's now past menopause, like the changes in how my body reaches orgasm are so different than they were 30 years ago,
mhm,
30 years ago when we first got married. And when my husband pays attention to that, and it's important for him for me to receive pleasure, then I feel closer to him. I feel more connected to him and I'm more inclined to want to have sex. Where
yeah,
if he was just centering his own pleasure, I'd probably be checked out by now. Like I
yeah,
would not be very
yeah,
interested in being intimate.
exactly,
So, yeah.
exactly.
I don't know if you can read any of the questions because I can't see them the way I've got my thing set up. If there's
Okay,
anything else
so
that you want to pull out before we get to
yeah,
the final point.
let me just read this quick. I often hear in my own circles the idea of I deserve it, but more of it's expected as married people. Like how much sex are you having? Are you sharing intimate details? It seems weird for most people without a reason. Yes, I think the point she's making is like we're comparing ourselves to other people. We're saying, well, most people, I'm supposed to be having sex this much. And what we found in our study um, is that yes, more sex does tend to result in better marriages in general. But sex alone doesn't make your marriage good. So if you have a lot of sex, but all your other aspects of marriage are bad,
Right.
then you're like, you can't talk, you can't share with each other, then that actually is worse. And people who have sex every day are actually worse off. And likely because most women don't want to have sex every day. So people who have daily sex, there's something weird going on, right? So sex frequency in and of itself isn't really the point. It's why are you
Mhm.
having
Mhm.
sex? And
Mhm.
people go through different periods of time, right? Like, yeah, in the first few years if you're if you don't have kids yet, sex might be really frequent and really fun. And then kids
Yeah.
come and you're exhausted and it's okay. And I think we put a lot of pressure on women to make sure that sex is exactly the same throughout your marriage, right? Like you're supposed to have
Mhm.
sex every 72 hours and it's never supposed to stray from that, as opposed to saying, your sex life reflects the life that you share with each other.
Yes.
And so in those periods where you're heavily stressed and you've got babies, yeah, sex may be not as frequent, but you can connect in other ways. You can connect over holding this baby, and caring for this baby. Or when you're going through periods where, you're going through menopause or you're going through health struggles or stress or your parents getting sick, and more intense caregiving roles,
Mhm.
sex isn't going to look the same. And the idea that sex should always look the same really means that they have divorced sex from any kind of emotional connection. Because if sex is supposed to look the same no matter what your life is going through, then sex is not about your relationship.
Yeah.
And I think we need to allow the fact that, what if we're going through a difficult period, if we've realized there's major entitlement in the marriage and we need to work through that, or there's porn use in the marriage and we need to work through that, or
Mhm.
there's or we maybe there's nothing no big major sin issue, but we've realized somebody's got some major emotional immaturity and they're getting triggered by silly things and we need to get some therapy.
Yeah.
Sex, that's going to affect your sex life and that is okay because
Right.
sex should flow from your relationship. It shouldn't be completely separate from your relationship. And too often we treat it
Exactly.
like sex is something which is separate, which should always look the same no matter what we're going through. And when we say that, then we're really saying that sex isn't about intimacy. And I find that
Yeah.
real
That's
scary.
good. That's a good
Mhm.
word. Yeah. So I want to move towards ending the conversation, but I'd love to talk about what both partners can do to diminish or eradicate. First and foremost, I feel like if men really need to be curious about how their actions or their mindsets affect their wives. And if they have done things that have been misogynistic or have been fueled by entitlement, they really do need to apologize, to name it, to take responsibility for it, because that in and of itself, that acknowledgement can be healing for a woman. And then, for them to begin to think about, well, how can I love sacrificially in the bedroom? What would that look like? What might it look like to decenter my pleasure and instead center my wife's pleasure? So that's,
Mhm.
one of the things that comes to mind for me, but I'd love to hear from you. Like, what are other actions that men could take to diminish entitlement and misogyny in the bedroom?
Um, I think a huge part of it is to recognize that connection doesn't flow from sex, sex flows from connection. And the way that we often hear it in the evangelical church is like, he needs sex to connect, she needs the emotional to connect. And so you just need to meet each other's needs. And I used to teach this. Like, this was kind of, this was in the
Mm,
water. And this was one of the major things I stopped teaching once we did the research for the Great Sex Rescue. And I realized how wrong that was. And I saw the data. But if we can realize that sex flows from connection, then even if
mhm.
sex isn't happening as much as you would want it, you can still work on connection, which is going to grow your relationship.
Right.
And when women have high marital satisfaction and when women feel emotionally connected during sex, they're going to want sex more
Yes.
because they don't feel used. And I think that's a huge starting point. Um, excuse me. The idea of not centering your own pleasure too. It's so strange, but, like, men would not have sex if they didn't reach orgasm. Like, orgasm is an essential part of sex for men. It's assumed that it's an optional part for
Yeah.
women, and I think women assume that too, and if we wanna have good sex lives, actually, we
Yes.
both need to start prioritizing our pleasure, because a lot of
Mhm.
women don't prioritize our pleasure because we're so used to, "I need to have sex for him," that
Yeah.
we don't really think about what I want or what I need. And sex is one of those, like, and I remember reading The Meaning of Marriage by Tim Keller, and I've used this passage before. We talked about this passage in The Great Sex Rescue and how it sounds holy, but it's actually very bad sex advice, which is Tim Keller was talking about how when he and Kathy first got married, sex was difficult for her and she wasn't experiencing a lot of pleasure and they felt like it was a pass fail thing. And so they just decided to
Mm,
stop focusing on her pleasure and that this was a much better way of handling it. And it's like that is such bad advice because he is still receiving pleasure,
right.
right? And actually the best way and so he said, like, instead, we're gonna focus on the pleasure we can give each other rather than anything else. And so she was instead of focusing on her own pleasure, she was gonna focus on his. Well, actually, research studies have shown that if she wants to reach an orgasm, she needs to focus on her own pleasure, not his. And he needs to focus on her pleasure, not his. Like, the way to make sex
Yes,
great is for
yes,
both of you to focus on her pleasure. Because if you're
right.
focusing on his, you're actually not paying attention to your body and sex doesn't work as well. And if he's focused on his, then sex doesn't last long enough. So this idea that
Right.
what women need to do is just focus on making sex good for him. No. We have a 47-point orgasm gap. Sex is already good for him.
Yes,
you know,
yes.
like, we need to focus on what makes sex good for her too. And
And when you say focus on that, can you say more about that? Like, knowing what gives her pleasure, communicating in the
yeah.
moment, talking about it afterwards? Like, what are some of the ways that, a woman can do that if she has been stuck in a marriage where it has been all about her husband's pleasure?
Yeah, well, first of all, the big one of the biggest things is you can say it's perfectly okay to say to your husband, "You know what? I wanna have a great sex life with you. I want I want everything to be amazing, but what I'm not willing to do is be treated like a sex toy anymore, and so I am no longer willing to have
Mhm.
sex where it's all about you. Like, until we're gonna learn how to make
Amen.
this a mutual experience, I'm not willing
Yeah.
to be used anymore." And I think a lot of women feel like that's off the table. They're not allowed to say that if they're married. But think about it. Why does he get to have all the orgasms and you get to have none and that's okay? Like, there's nothing magical about the penis entering the vagina that God is happy about. Like, I think we truly believe that God is happy about that. No, what God is happy about is when you both experience true intimacy and connection. And having
Yeah,
sex which leaves you feeling used is not experiencing true intimacy and connection. And, him getting to use your body without any kind of connection is not pleasing to God. And so I think,
I
saying to your
totally agree.
husband, I'm no longer willing to be treated like an object to be used. And until we're going to make this mutual, then forget it. Um, that's totally now, if you're gonna say that, please read The Great Sex Rescue together or, or something so that he understands what the
Yeah.
issues are, but yeah. And then I think just,
And
like,
what if
when you're
Go
actually
ahead.
having sex, figure out what feels good, and tell him that so that it's not just about him having intercourse, but it's about doing things together that actually feel good for
Right.
you. Mhm.
So one last question for you is what happens in a marriage where if a woman brings this up, if she says, I'm really am more interested in having a sex life that is mutual, that where I receive pleasure too, and he completely discounts it, what advice would you give that woman?
Again, you don't need to be treated like an object, and I hear from so many women saying, "I tried to talk to him about it. He wouldn't listen, and so sex is still terrible." And I'm like, "Why are you still having sex? Like, why?"
Mm,
And people will point to the do not deprive verse, but honey, if you are feeling used after sex and you're not reaching orgasm, you already are being deprived. Like, he is the one depriving you. You aren't depriving
yeah.
him by saying, "I refuse to be used." He's already been depriving you. And if he doesn't understand that that's not okay, this is where you need to bring in a counselor. You need to see a counselor
Yeah.
yourself. Um, this is either a sign of abuse or extreme emotional immaturity. But either way, it isn't going to help. And when you keep having sex that your body hates, that actually can, um, over years, that can develop CPTSD, so complex post traumatic
Yeah.
stress disorder. It isn't okay to do. And yeah, like, you don't need to be treated like an object. So if
So
you if you s
you're saying essentially set a boundary and say if
yeah,
this is what is gonna be, then we're not having sex
yeah, mhm,
as a way to
mhm,
get the attention of the male partner.
because you're already not having sex. Like, this is the thing, you are already not having sex because biblically, sex is something which is mutual, intimate, and pleasurable for both. If he is simply using your
Yeah.
body for intercourse, you already are not having sex. So saying, "I don't want to have intercourse where you treat my body like something to be used," is not depriving him
Mhm.
of sex the way God intended. You're already
Yeah.
not having sex the way God intended. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I love your clarity. Like you just have so much clarity on this, and it really is it's refreshing for me to hear you say that because I have heard so many times at so many conferences, through reading books, a message that's completely contradictory. And I think what we both believe very strongly is that good, healthy sex is worth fighting for, and that misogyny and entitlement should not be a normative part of marriages. And if it
Yeah,
is, there's work to be done so that that improves for both folks.
yeah. There's a really interesting question here, I just wanna, talk
You
about it.
wanna bring up or
She's
respond to,
yeah.
otherwise we can just bring it to a close.
Yeah, let me just deal with this one. She says, as someone deconstructing purity culture, I'm curious how internalized misogyny for women shows up in the bedroom because she says, I struggle with even allowing myself to feel pleasure because of the shame and messages I've internalized. And have you seen this with other women too? I really have. And
Yeah.
I've also spoken to so many men who would love for their wives to experience pleasure and actually want to learn how to please their wives, and their wives are like, "No, just let's just get it over with. I wanna do" like, basically, "I wanna do my
Mhm.
duty."
Yeah.
And she doesn't allow herself, to really embody, get
Mhm.
experience
Mhm.
sex as a fully embodied person, um, because sex carries a lot of shame for her because there is so much obligation and duty, and he's like,
Yeah.
"That's not what I want." Like, I want so it's not always that there's a bad guy in this story. Sometimes it's
Right,
just that we have
right.
internalized such terrible messages that we can't let ourselves let go. We can't let ourselves, really
Yeah.
experience pleasure. And, that's something that a therapist can help you work through. I think reading The Great Sex Rescue can help, understanding how your body works. But yeah, it can be hard. But I think there's a lot of men who would
Yes.
much rather do things slowly and go back to the beginning, and would be willing to do that if you just said, "I'm really struggling with this, and I know there's something better out there for us, but I just don't know how to get there."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you that counseling is probably really an essential component of that, particularly uh, unpacking all of the shame
Mhm. Yeah.
or
Yeah.
the woman's. Well, this has been a great conversation. We could keep going, but I want to honor the time commitment. So do consider buying both of our books, For the Love of Women, The Great Sex Rescue. Sheila has many other books. We're both on Substack, so consider following us. And I'm going to give away 2 copies, one of Sheila's book and one of my book. So if you're interested in that, please um, follow or what am I trying to say? Leave a comment and tag us so that we know that you did it, and
Mhm.
tell us which book you'd prefer to have. Really grateful for you, Sheila, for your work, for this conversation, and hopefully, folks were helped and encouraged by it.
Yeah, thanks. Good to talk to you, Dorothy.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much, everybody, for coming. Bye bye.